I'm ready, Lizzie. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Then with that, I have 6 minutes here on the clock. We can go ahead and get started. Voting for next year's debate resolutions just ended, and while I and my brother both unfortunately forgot to vote for the resolution that we wanted to do, I think that we can both agree that it's still a great idea that the people, the debaters themselves, are able to choose what kind of resolution that they want to be debating. Let's take a different situation, and one that most debaters probably wouldn't be as happy with. One where the STOA board members, instead of allowing the debaters to decide, choose for themselves what kind of debate resolution all the debaters must debate. Well, of course, as a debater, I would be outraged, and for good reason. Because the STOA board members ultimately owe it to the debaters to decide what kind of resolution that they themselves want to debate. Which leads me to affirm the resolution that in general policymaking, politicians ought to value representation over principle. Again, politicians ought to value representation over principle. Now, of course, we have to understand these two terms. My first definition is representation. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a peer-reviewed academic journal, in an article revised in 2018 said, quote, political representation is the activity of making citizens' voices, opinions, and perspectives present in public policy-making processes, end quote. And an important part of understanding how exactly you bring in the public's voice into making decisions is that not always can you get every single person's decision at the same time. So you try to find a compromise between them, and if that's not possible, you go with whatever the majority of the people would generally want. And my second definition is principle. And again, principle is more of a loose term, but in general, it means when the politician operates on some kind of guiding rule or idea that goes against what the public wants. So in other words, they do what they want instead of what the public would want to do. Now, before we go any further, we also have to understand a little bit more about the resolution, which leads me to my resolutional analysis point about general rule. Again, general rule. I'm not saying 100% of the time politicians ought to value representation. Of course, there are exceptions in specific situations where that might not always be the case. But we shouldn't be looking at very specific individualized cases to make our decision. Instead, we look at principles that will apply in a broad range of situations that will make something generally desirable, no matter what the outcome in one specific situation. Although we should be looking to specific applications to understand how those general rules do play out. My value or way of weighing this debate round is that of societal progress. Again, societal progress. And within the bounds of the resolution, or in the context of a politician making decisions, it generally comes down to making policies that will protect and benefit the citizens, as well as creating a system where the citizens ultimately are benefited and not put at a risk or put at a disadvantage. My value link is basic objective. Again, basic objective. One of the main reasons why government exists is to benefit the people and to make sure that they are benefited and that they are also being protected instead of being, as I said before, put at a disadvantage. And it is my position that representation does just that. Which just leads me to my first contention that representation leads to progress. Again, representation leads to progress. And it does this in a number of different ways. Subpoint A is civic participation. Again, civic participation. Every 4 years in the United States, there's a presidential election. And because we as citizens are allowed to decide what kind of president that we want to put in office and make decisions, it's generally decisions that we want them to make, we go out and we research what kind of president that we want to vote for. We look at all the different candidates and find one that we agree with. In a society that doesn't let the public choose what kind of president that they want to have, no one's really going to be digging in and understanding the policies like we can in a democratically elected country or government. Subpoint B is successfully implemented policies. Again, successfully implemented policies. Whenever a political body is more representative, the policies ultimately are going to be more effective because the public in general complies with them instead of doing what they can to subvert those policies or go against them. In fact, in 2014, two Norwegian professors who specialize in political participation and behavior conducted a study involving over 3,200 people. And they found that the more representative a political body is, the more accepting the public is of the policies that are made. They say, quote, we examine whether descriptive representation helps with popular willingness to accept a political decision. We find that it does. This has important implications for legitimacy of policy making in democracy, as the acceptability of a decision increases compliance and facilitates implementation, end quote. So in other words, as a general rule, whenever a policy is representative, it's going to have more of an impact because the public is more likely to go along with it. Subpoint C is effective solutions. Again, effective solutions. When we talk about a decision that the politician is making, representation means bringing in the voices and opinions of those who are out there and directly dealing with the problems in their communities and who understand the most effective way to solve those very problems. While principle, on the other hand, disregards what those people say and instead go with whatever they want to do. Just like in the example of the STOA members voting, the debaters get to vote on what kind of resolution they want to debate, and not the elite few in charge in leadership. Subpoint D is government accountability. Again, government accountability. Whenever the people feel that the government is taking too much power or are going in the wrong direction, they have the ability to pull it back. At principle, when we value it as a general rule, means the politician will consistently disregard whatever the public's opinion on a subject is, and do instead what they want to do. And that simply is unacceptable. Thank you.
All right. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Can you restate your definition of principle, please?
Yes. I personally defined it as when a politician operates on some kind of guiding rule or doctrine or idea that goes against what the public wants.
Okay, so it's some kind of personal belief that a politician holds.
Yes, generally whatever they believe that or something that they want to do.
Okay. What did you define societal progress as?
It was when the government, well, at least in the context of the resolution, makes policies that will protect and benefit the citizens.
So we're progressing toward the best society possible?
Well, yes, societal progress means making sure that society is taking steps in the right direction.
Okay, who defines what the right direction is?
The citizens.
Okay, so when the majority of people want something, that's what's best for the society?
Well, as a general rule, we look to the people to decide what kinds of decisions are made.
Okay. You brought up the study from Norway. How did they conduct that study?
They took about 3,000, a little over 3,200 people, and they went through the survey experiment talking about how the people would react to different policies if the policies were representative or if they were more going against what the representation would have had. So,
Okay, sorry. So they surveyed people to ask them whether they would comply with the law or whether they would not?
it wasn't just a simple yes or no question about whether they would comply. It was more talking about the level to which they agree with those policies and how they would react on a community level.
So when we're talking about a representative policy, what percentage of the populace do you think would be behind this majority that agrees?
It completely depends on the situation and the type of policy.
Okay. Do you think it's nearer to 100 or nearer to 50?
Now, once again, it could be any number depending on the situation and the policy that's being proposed.
So do you believe that the majority of policies have to do with 100% of the populace believing something?
I'd say there are certainly a variety of situations where the majority of the public, a vast majority, close to 100% or around that area, will be on board with one kind of idea.
So you believe that the majority of policies where this conflict comes into play have to do with 100% of people believing something that a politician doesn't believe?
No, I'd say if we look at the realm of general policy making, there are a lot of people with different views, but generally that conflict maybe average around 50 to 30%. However, I honestly have no reason to make those numbers. That's just a guess.
Okay, when it comes to general policy making, what percentage do you think this conflict comes up in?
Like I said before, it really depends on the general policy.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and take some prep time. All right, stopping prep time. I have 2 minutes remaining.
Also, I apologize for not giving you the 30-second warnings that we agreed upon.
Oh, no problem. All right, and if everyone's ready, 7 minutes on the clock, I will go ahead and get started. Is it ever responsible to endorse a policy that you believe will fail, or worse, do harm to your country? Countries require strong leaders, and those leaders are trusted to make good decisions. Leaders need to believe in the plans that they propose. And it is because I don't want to live in the kind of political system in which politicians recommend policies that they believe to be bad ideas that I negate the resolution that politicians ought to value representation over principle. I'll go ahead and agree to both the definitions presented and the resolutional analysis of general rule. However, I don't agree with the value. The value brought up was that of societal progress. And the problem I have with the value is it's a little bit too broad. People have different definitions of what progressing toward the ideal society is, and that differs per country. So to specify this to this resolution, my counter value is that of responsible policy making. I think Evan and I are talking about the same thing here. Responsible policy making simply narrows it down to actually creating policies. When we make responsible policies, it means that the ones that are making the policy have thought through all the options and believe what is being passed is the best option and will result in good. And again, the reason that we should be using this value is because it's the purpose of politicians. The very reason we have politicians in the first place is to create the best policies, the ones that will fix the problem in the most effective manner. Let's go ahead and look at two contentions before specifically responding to Evan's contention. My first contention is that principle brings about responsible policy making. Again, principle brings about responsible policy making. It is responsible to endorse and create policies that you believe to be the best and that you believe will succeed. The majority of the time, politicians should vote for plans that they agree with and that the people agree with. But when these two things come into conflict, when a politician is forced to choose between the people's opinion and his own opinion, a politician siding with their principle creates the most responsible policy. A country can never progress unless politicians stick to what they believe. An application of this is Supreme Court decisions. Supreme Court justices are politicians. They interpret laws and set precedent for how the law will be used in the future. However, the Supreme Court is completely separate from public opinion. Even though many of the cases tried in the Supreme Court are some of the most controversial social issues that exist, the Supreme Court justices make their decisions solely upon their own principles and opinions. Cases like the Civil Rights Act were highly controversial at the time, and public opinion was often against the justices. However, the justices still stuck by what they believed, and the law was upheld and justice was served, in examples like the Civil Rights Act, Brown versus Board of Education, U.S. versus Nixon, and Miranda versus Arizona. Contention 2 is that representation doesn't bring about responsible policies. Again, representation doesn't bring about responsible policies. Leo Tolstoy once said, "Wrong does not cease to be wrong just because the majority share in it. Even though the majority of people believe that something is right, that doesn't mean that it is." If a politician were to pass a policy that the people supported, but which they believe would fail, that wouldn't constitute a responsible policy. And an application of this is complex laws. Interest rates, budget cuts, tariffs and sanctions, military policy, and even defense mechanisms against pandemics. These are all complex areas of policy that the average citizen does not fully understand. People often have opinions about areas of policy in which there are many complex and changing variables. In this case, if the politician were to listen to uninformed citizens, then a disastrous and harmful policies could be implemented. Many people believe in conspiracy theories or other policies that don't take into account all factors that affect that specific policy area. Governmental policies should not be informed or created by those that don't have all the facts. The only way to ensure responsible policies is to make sure that politicians are voting with what they actually believe, not simply blindly accepting what others believe. But let's go ahead and look at the specific contention. His subpoint A was about civic participation. My response is no conflict. The specific example that he brought up is voting. Voting, we're not actually dealing with a conflict because there's no politician's principles interfering with the people's right to vote. We can only look at examples where these two things are coming in direct conflict because of those are the areas covered under the resolution. Next, he talked about successfully implemented policies and effective solutions and government accountabilities. And I'm going to group all of these under one response. Simply that they're unrealistic. They're unrealistic. We can't claim that we're going to have this government accountability, these effective solutions, and successfully implemented policies all because we're trusting that the majority knows best. Majority rule doesn't always prove to be best, and people have misinformed opinions. Politicians are the people who are actually working the area that their policies are being implemented in and who know what is best for the specific policies. We can't assume that the majority is actually right in certain areas. And again, just because the majority of people believe something, that doesn't mean that it's right. We can't assume that people are going to be more involved in the government, or that there will actually be effective solutions, or that we're somehow going to have government accountability, because we cannot assume that the people are always right. The final point that you brought up was under successfully implemented policies. And there was a study, this Norwegian study, that was essentially a survey, and that's my one response. It was a survey, not a study. What these doctors did is they surveyed about 3,000 people and asked them, if you supported a law, would you follow that law? And of course the people said yes, because if you support a law, then obviously you want it to happen, and therefore you will follow that law. But the problem is this doesn't actually translate over to this resolution. It doesn't translate over because, first of all, people won't always do what they tell researchers they will do, but also because we're not necessarily talking about the majority of people in an actual country. The majority is often less than the majority of the people in the country. It may be closer to 30% because only 30% of people actually agree on a solution, where the rest of the people are spread among different solutions or simply don't have an opinion. So even if 30% of people agree with a specific solution, that leaves 70% of the people who won't follow through with that policy, will still break the law. So you can't claim that we're actually going to see more people following these laws, because we can't claim that the majority of people actually support the law. Plus, it was a survey, not a study. The only way to claim responsible policies is to make sure that the people who are supporting them actually believe in them. Thank you.
All right. I have 3 minutes here on the clock. If you're ready, Lizzie?
Yes.
Then let's go ahead and get started. How are politicians given their power?
They are voted in by the people.
Okay, so when we talk about politicians making a choice about what policies, we're talking about politicians who have been actively given power by the choice of the people.
Yes.
Okay, and you talked about the Supreme Court in your first application. How are the justices elected and appointed into that position?
They're appointed by the president and elected by the Senate.
And who put the president and the Senate there?
The people.
Okay, the people. And would you agree with me that, let's say, just taking an example of a president who has the ability to appoint a Supreme Court justice, would you say that president's choice of a Supreme Court justice would factor into a lot of people's votes for who they would want to put as the president?
It really depends on the situation. If it's an important vote, then probably. But if it's less of an important vote, like there's already a majority that the people agree with, then no.
Okay, but would you say that in general, the idea of a president who has the ability to elect a justice will have some kind of importance to the voters?
Again, it depends on the situation.
Okay. And you talked about the idea of complex laws in your second contention. So would you say that most laws are too complex for the average citizen to understand, or just a couple?
I'd say most laws are pretty complex, yeah.
All right, so, and how many of these laws would you say factor into the majority of a citizen's average political beliefs?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that question?
All right, so of those laws that are mostly too complicated for the citizens, how many of them directly affect that citizen's political beliefs?
I'd say citizens might have an opinion about the general policy area. They may not be aware of the specific bill, but still aware of the policy area.
Yeah, so are you saying then, is it your contention that in general citizens aren't qualified to have many of the political views that they have of general policy?
No, of course the people are qualified to have their beliefs, just simply not write legislation and actually understand all the variables that are affecting the specific area of policy.
Right. So you say that for general policy, they are allowed, or they are qualified to have beliefs, but just not when it comes to specific legislation.
Or specific areas of the policy, yes.
And what kinds of areas of policy would that conflict?
So as I mentioned, a couple, as in interest rates or tariffs and sanctions, military policy, specific areas.
All right, no further questions. And I'll be starting some prep time. 3 minutes on the clock.
Thirty seconds used. One minute used.
All right, I'm stopping prep time with about 1 minute and 50 seconds remaining. All right, 4 minutes here on the timer. I'll assume that everyone's ready. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. Lizzie doesn't just have to prove that principle is a better decision some of the time. She has to prove that as a general rule, the politician ought to go with what they believe versus whatever the public is saying. And I want to show you how she has not done that, and show you ultimately why representation is still the better choice when it comes to the general principles that apply across every situation. Start off with the value. She talked about how the value of societal progress is too broad and about how responsible policymaking narrows it down. I'm just going to go ahead and agree because ultimately we both talked about the idea of making good policies that protect and benefit the citizens like I was talking about before. Let's move down on to her contentions. Her first contention was that principle leads to responsible policymaking, and she talked about the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, I'm going to have two responses to the Supreme Court of the United States, which also tie into the logic of the whole contention. My first response is not separate. Again, not separate. She said that the Supreme Court is designed to be completely separate of all political opinions, and she brought up an example or some examples of where they made unpopular decisions. And I completely agree. While the Supreme Court is, in theory, supposed to be completely devoid of all public sway and opinion, and they do have the ability to make unpopular decisions, actually, the Supreme Court is much more influenced by public opinion than you might at first expect. The process for a person to become a justice is they have to be appointed by the Senate, or they have to be elected, or at least voted in by the Senate, who are in turn put in place by all the state constituents. And also the president has to appoint them, who is in turn put in place by all of his separate constituents. Ultimately, when we look down to an asked and cross-examination, if a politician's or if the president's appointment or choice of appointment would be of a big concern for the voters. And she said, it depends. Well, actually, I would completely disagree. I would say that not for everyone, certainly, but for the majority of the people, the kind of justice who is going to be making very important decisions will very extremely play into each citizen's vote. And why that matters is because ultimately the Supreme Court justices who will be making decisions are ultimately put in place by the people and what the people ultimately would want. My second response is goes both ways. Again, goes both ways. The Supreme Court has certainly made unpopular decisions that are very ethical. But that doesn't mean that as a general rule, number one, they continue to do that, or number two, it's actually as good for them. The Supreme Court throughout history has also made a number of terrible decisions. One example is Plessy versus Ferguson, where they upheld the general opinion or the principles of the politicians were upholding the segregation laws that were very terrible, essentially going back to before the Civil War when slaves and people of color were treated terribly. Another example is Buck versus Bell, where essentially the Supreme Court ruled that the forced sterilization of intellectually disabled people is allowed. It's something that completely awful decisions because the Supreme Court ultimately is not as infallible and just as the people are. Let's move on to our second contention. I have three responses to our application of complex laws. My first response is general policy. Again, general policy. We're talking about policy, not just the areas that are too complex for the citizens, but also the areas that everyone is qualified to have. Now, she said that, well, actually, most laws are too complicated because they don't have all the information. But honestly, that isn't the case. For the vast majority of policies, there's not all that much information that's necessary. My second response is those with opinions. Again, those with opinions. The people who are most vocal and outspoken about complex areas are those who actually understand them. If I don't understand an area, I'm not going to be outspoken about it. Politicians are people too. And for all these reasons, representation as a general rule is still the better choice. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and use some prep time. I have 2 minutes remaining. All right, assuming everyone's ready, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to take you back to the question I asked at the very beginning of this round. Is it ever responsible to endorse a policy that you believe will worsen your country? See, Evan is asking you to vote for a world in which politicians are blindly accepting what somebody else believes rather than what they are believing, and endorse policies that they believe will do harm to their country. That's not what politicians are in place to do, and that's not what we trust politicians to do. We're essentially giving them the power, or rather encouraging them to vote against what they believe. That's not responsible policymaking. So go ahead and get into Evan's argument. He argued against my application of the Supreme Court by firstly saying that it's not separate. My one response is that vote off principle. They're still voting off principle. How they got there is a different issue, but they're still there to vote off principle. Sure, everyone is swayed by public opinion in some way, but they're still voting off their principle, and they have to write an incredibly long paper on why they voted off their principle. So the fact that they were voted in by the Senate and appointed by the president, which all comes back to the people, still it doesn't affect the fact that they vote off their principle. So this application still stands. Secondly, he said it goes both ways. My response is majority good. I'll completely agree that the Supreme Court has had isolated incidents where they made bad judgments. However, the majority of their judgments have been good concerning considering that it has to do with how they interpret laws. If we gave this responsibility to the people, it would turn out disastrous, since the people haven't spent their entire life studying those laws and understanding how they apply to everyday situations. My second application was about complex laws. He said, first of all, that we're talking about general policy and people understand general policy. My response is specific details. Specific details. So let's look at budgeting, for example. The 2021 fiscal budget is coming up. And if we gave this responsibility to the people, if we let them decide what we did with our budget, it would turn out pretty disastrous because there are so many different areas that need funding. Everyone kind of gets annoyed when the budget comes out to be several $1 trillion, and that's coming from taxes, but that's because there are so many different areas that are going to budget. So while people do understand the budget as a whole, they don't understand the specific details. And if we gave the task of setting out the budget to the people, it would be a disaster. His second argument was about those with opinions. My response is uninformed opinions. There are plenty of people who have completely uninformed opinions about politics. We know this by going to Thanksgiving meal with our relatives. There are people who simply don't understand what's going on our political system, but still have opinions. Sure, you shouldn't have an opinion unless you're informed, but it absolutely still happens. There are still people who form policies that are absolutely terrible and people who get behind them. Let's go ahead and look at two voting issues. My first voting issue is that of an uninformed majority. An uninformed majority. As I talked about in my response to the case that went unresponded, my whole premise was that we cannot assume that the majority are actually informed. We can't assume that they actually know what they're talking about. Evan's entire case relies on this principle that the majority must be right, but that's not necessarily correct because people can get behind emotion and get behind a policy that is utterly incorrect. What we should do instead is trust our policies to the people that we trusted to make our policies for us, the politicians who are there in the work field, knowing exactly what they're doing and knowing the specific areas of policy. We can't trust policies to the majority. We can't trust them to make specific policy decisions in very specific policy areas. My second voting issue is principle produces responsible policies. Principle produces responsible policies. It all comes back to this value of responsible policy making. Evan and I both want a world in which policies are made and thought out, the process is thought out, and the best policy is put into effect. That only comes when politicians vote based off their principle. And in an ideal world, the politician's principle and the people's opinion line up. But when those two things don't line up, we have to side with the politician's principle because they're the ones who actually work in that area. They're the ones who actually understand the specific policy making. And the only way to ensure responsible policy is that they are endorsing policies that they believe will work. It's not responsible policy making if the politicians are voting for plans that they believe will fail, that go against their personal principles. In that world, they are blindly accepting somebody else's policy, what the people believe to be true, what the majority believe to be true, but not actually what they believe to be true. Only principle produces responsible policies when these two things come into conflict. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and finish the remainder of my prep time. All right. This will be a 3-minute speech. I'll assume that my judge and my opponent are ready. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I want to ask the same question that Lizzie was asking in both her speeches, but just changed up a little bit. Would you want to live in a world where the politicians and those in charge consistently did not listen to you and instead did whatever they want? Well, that's a scary world, isn't it? But that's exactly what you're voting for if you vote to make principle a consistent rule instead of an exception by necessity. And that's what I want to be proving to you and demonstrating to you in this final speech, talking about the idea of the general rule versus the exceptions and what is inherently more desirable and what we ought to make the forefront of our policy making. My first voting issue will tie up a bunch of the arguments that were made in the last speech. My first voting issue is that politicians are fallible. Again, politicians are fallible. This is something that I don't think I mentioned enough in my last speech due to how important it has to be. She talked about the idea of how politicians will vote off of their principle and how the majority of the decisions that they make are actually good with regards to the Supreme Court. Now, I have a couple of responses. My first response is proves fallible. Again, proves fallible. The idea of how a justice got elected into that position directly ties into the policies and the decisions that they will be making. Because the people, if they believe a politician will elect a justice who will make policy decisions that they agree with, they're going to make sure and do everything that they can to make sure that justice is elected. Thus, the decisions that are being made are directly affected by the people's own will. That, once again, proves that the politician isn't someone who's directly separated from the people. However, there's another issue that also goes by. And my second response is still emotionally driven. Again, still emotionally driven. What Lizzie is essentially saying is that the majority aren't always good, and the majority don't always know what's best for them, and because they can be emotionally driven. But what she would have you do in the alternative is listen to the emotional whims and sways of one person versus the emotional whims and sways of many people. That's essentially what it comes down to when we boil it down on an emotional scale. Because once again, principle means listening to the voice of one person instead of listening to the voice of the many. Next, she talked about specific details in response to general policy. My response is specifics covered. Again, specifics covered. I agree that the budget does have a lot of different decisions being made. It does require a lot of different people to make different decisions. But the exact same applies to a politician. One politician can't decide the entirety of the budget. That has to be split up among a bunch of different people. Next, she talked about uninformed opinions. My first response is equally applies. Again, equally applies. Politicians also, very many, make uninformed decisions. However, people are affected directly by the problems that directly affect them, and they understand what's best in those situations. When it comes to general policy, we have to listen to the voice of the many instead of the voice of the few. Thank you.
All right, awesome job, you guys.